Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a series of 3 spring seminars hosted by the Tallgrass Prairie Center at the University of Northern Iowa. We're really glad that you're able to join us this afternoon. We're also happy that this is a virtual presentation because it's the weather's not so great out there. Certainly wouldn't be good for a field day. I'm Laura Walter. I'm the Plant Materials Program Manager at the TPC, where our mission is to empower people to value and restore resilient, diverse tallgrass prairie. Our seminar series this year is centered on remnant prairies, their importance, the perils they face, and the people who protect, study, and care for them. Remnant prairies are the last pieces of Iowa's once expansive prairies that survived the changes of the past 170 years. The out-of-the-way little corners, rocky hillsides, the wet sloughs, the pioneer cemeteries and roadsides that were spared the plow. They are small, fragmented, and isolated, but they are also a source of renewal through the seeds they produce and a guide against which we can measure the success of new planted prairies. All of us at the TPC value them at a level that's deeper than these practical biological considerations, though. Remnant prairies are places that touch our souls, that we return to for beauty and for solace, and where we know that our curiosity will always be fed. We hope that this series of talks will inspire you too to get to know the remnant prairies near you and to get involved in their care and protection. One way to get started would be to join the Iowa Prairie Network. You can get connected with them to find prairie walks and events like the upcoming winter seminar. Information is available at the website address shown on the slide, iowaprairienetwork.org. Today's talk is going to be in 3 parts once I get done with this introduction. First, you'll hear from Ray Hamilton, then Tony Vorwald will speak, and finally, there will be time for discussion of questions that we've prepared and questions from you. Please feel free to add your questions using the Q&A button at any time during the seminar, and we will try to get to them by the end of the hour. Just before I introduce today's speakers, I would like to express our gratitude for the Friends of the TPC for their sponsorship of this seminar series. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. It's so exciting to see all of these names, all of these friends who've joined us today. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. And these are 2 of my prairie heroes, and I'm serious. I see Tony's response there. But they're 2 people I met through connections with the Iowa Prairie Network, and they are doing wonderful work that I think a lot of us could emulate in our care of prairies. Our first speaker today is going to be Ray Hamilton. Ray is a retired family practice and emergency room doctor. He and his family have been active in identification and protection of about a dozen high-quality natural areas in eastern Iowa. The Hamiltons personally have transferred ownership of a native prairie and a fen to the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. They still own their flagship, the Codfish Hollow Prairie, which is beautiful, northeast of Maquoketa, which has permanent protection via a conservation easement with the INHF. Ray served on the Jackson County Conservation Board for 10 years, on the Iowa Nature Conservancy Board, and is a founding member of the Iowa Prairie Network, and he's the author of the Native Prairie Management Guide. When not working on prairies, Ray enjoys woodworking, fishing, and playing dolls and getting his hair fixed by his 6 young granddaughters. The 3 grandsons like to drive tractors with their papa. We get to the prairie for real fun, is what Ray says. And it was Ray who introduced me to our second speaker, Tony Vorwald, or rather to his work before I ever met Tony. Ray led an IPN field trip, that was Iowa Prairie Network, an IPN field trip to Ozark Wildlife Area. It's the Jackson County Park where Tony has continued and expanded upon the restoration work that Ray began. The results of this are just stunning. It's amazing. It was well worth climbing the rugged trails. I mean, we actually had to haul ourselves up with a rope to reach one of the remnant restored hill prairies. And at that point, I knew I got to meet this guy. So Tony has worked for Jackson County Conservation for 6 years. Tony earned an associate's degree in natural resources management from Hawkeye Community College and a bachelor's degree in environmental science from the University of Dubuque. He also holds a graduate certificate in environmental education and a master's degree in integrated natural resources from the University of Idaho. Tony has completely fallen in love with the small remnant prairies that Jackson County Conservation manages and has spearheaded restoration efforts on the county's remnant prairies. He is working to implement a more well-rounded and diverse management regime for the remnant prairies that Jackson County manages. I'm just so happy to welcome Ray and Tony to speak with you today, to speak with all of us. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Ray.
Thank you, Laura. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. Laura kind of gave a great introduction, and I'm thankful for the Tallgrass Prairie Center for putting this seminar on. We'll get kind of right into it. I got into prairies as a young fella. I didn't know much about it, went to lots of field trips in Iowa, learned, and then started looking for prairies in the Jackson County area. And Tony and I are very lucky to have been able to spend time in this really, really diverse, beautiful, rugged county. We got everything from the coldest environments and woodlands to the warmest prairies and everything in between. So I thought I'd just start with how do we, find native prairies? These are, prairie remnants that haven't been disturbed yet. It's kind of unbelievable. There's still some around. And I always, I began looking and registering and talking to landowners. And I would do this primarily some of the time by just driving on the rural roads and in maybe the spring or fall when the prairie vegetation on some of these hills might be, the grasses are brown, in contrast with the green pastures of the, planted fields that we have. Quite often it was just talking to people, hey, if they're living out in Maquoketa, where do you live? And okay, if they're in farming, I'd ask them about their property. Do you have areas that haven't been, that you can't till? Yes, okay. Yeah, we got some cattle and they're up on a 40-acre parcel. Okay, so are those cattle there year round or no? There's some areas there that we really can't, get to it so easy. So that's a good sign right there. If there are cattle that have a hard time getting to a place because of obstacles, creeks, fencing, anything like that. I'd commonly ask, well, do you have water for your cattle in every spot? No, they can't get to a hill up here and this area there. We've got to keep them down by the water. But that's a plus. So those and in some areas of the county, this would be glacial rocks that are, in fields. Some areas it would be mucky, wet areas. The fens are that way if they're too wet to farm and so on. So these are obstacles to farming. So I'd hone in on that. And then I'd commonly say, hey, I'd like to take a look and actually go look and see. You might get some more indicators from them. Oh yeah, grandma used to pick flowers up from that hillside. Well, boy, that's a strong one there. So I'd make a home visit, look it over. And if I saw some good indicators there, I would usually, that sparked me up right there. And I'd say, well, look, I want to come back a different time of the year. And I'd come a second time, maybe bring a friend. And second or third time I do this, I'd say, look, I've got two people that are really interested in prairies, can they come? Yes. And oftentimes on a visit like that, you would get another family member or two, and maybe even a neighbor. And then you're showing them what's there, and you can figure out which family members are interested in this. And lots of times it's not the landowner or the farmer, it's okay, I'm going to get in trouble for this. It's usually a woman, and it's usually a spouse or a daughter or something like that. And so then I want to make sure I include them on everything. And they already have shown their excitement over the issue. And there you go. So then you develop a relationship for a few years. And in the proper time and cases, then I like to eventually talk to them about long-term protection. A lot of these people think, well, my kids are going to be here and they'll take good care of it. And over time, when you're with them enough, you can say, look, things don't work that way. When they're gone, there's another generation in there, things always change. There are much better ways to do this. And then I get to talking about, this is a special place. The best way to really do this, you need to get a conservation easement on this. And I discuss the issues. You can, you still own the land. You're just donating a part of it. And I describe it's, kind of like oil leases or property rights out west. Farmers still farm their property. They do what they want to do, but they'll lease out or sell a portion of it. It might be oil rights or mining rights or something where they can go underground. So this is the same thing and this conservation easement then is owned fully by an organization like the Natural Heritage Foundation or some of the other land grant organizations. We're fortunate in Iowa to have the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. It's statewide, it's dominant, it is strong. So I'd like to get into that topic matter. So that's actually, that's one of the parts of management. It's taking care of the long-term protection. And then we get into some other, then we talk about management issues. And I'm going to go to photographs here and see if I can, I've got a little bit of jockeying around here. Sorry about this. And I've got to go up here to share content. And I'll be right with you. You won't be looking at this stuff very long. And there we go. So one of the, I was fortunate enough to be able to help protect about different properties that have gone to U.S. Fish and Wildlife and Heritage Foundation, and a number of them in the county, about 1,200 acres, 3 miles of river frontage with beautiful areas. This is our Codfish Hollow Prairie in Maquoketa that we bought in 1984. And just to give you some of the management issues, we'll review that. You can see here where, first of all, for protecting this, this property has about a dozen rocky knolls that are native prairies. We see one dominantly here in the middle right, that hillside. There's one also to the left of that on the other side, that little valley. Those are two of the original native knolls. First of all, you could not see one knoll from the other when we got the property. There were trees in between that completely hid these from each other. So there was a decade of tree removal. The valleys here in between the knolls have always been farmed, and I have a really great land use history. I decided that I wanted to make a buffer zone, so those valleys in between are replanted with immediately local seeds that I picked all the flower seeds myself. I got junior high kids to help me get grasses from areas about 20 miles around the area. Site specific, so that the source seeds are taken from a similar geological structure and biological community. I did add a third component, and that was I did decide to add local plants here that were locally imperiled, that were not originally on this parcel, but are in some prairie parcels in the county that are going to be destroyed. They're declining, they're disappearing. And I did introduce some of those types of plants. Tree removal in that previous slide, I should mention right now that, and I'll repeat it, that every woody vegetation that was removed from this property, I've treated the base with dilute Roundup, and we'll talk about that a little bit better, stump treatment, never spraying, and we'll chat some more. So other management issues, what do? We clear the woody vegetation. This is a plant that came up early on. It's Hill's thistle. Hill's thistle is it's declining. It's state of Iowa. It's critically imperiled as far as the quantities. There are maybe in the prairie biome perhaps under 4,000 individual plants left in the area between Ontario and Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. So I could tell that these things, after a few years, I had a few of them there. I was a little concerned on that, and I didn't a little concerned about the numbers. They'd come up here and there, but pretty soon I found that I would have tractor paths and things like that in the property. And a few years later on those paths, these things would pop up. And so over time, excuse me here. Okay. Oh, I'm missing a slide. So over time, I noticed more and more of these on the native prairie where I had driven the tractor back and forth. This particular area, I'd done a lot of work a few, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, back and forth, dragging brush and trees out. So the tractor was going over it. It's probably nice prairie, but I do that mostly in the fall. And I noticed there were increased numbers of Hill's thistle. So I did, actually about 10 years before, I started mowing strips right across the prairie periodically, randomly. And if you look here, there's a little, from the lower right up through that fenced area, there's a little bit of a greenish path. That was one of these random strips that I mowed just one summer, and through the year I mowed it a few times without thinking too much where, just in this area. And then a year or so after that, I did happen to mow it again and use it as a fire break, although it actually wasn't burned. And lo and behold, last spring after these events, about 100 new fresh Hill's thistles came up. These are biennials. They come up 1 year and maybe a second or third year, then they flower and then they're done. There were 100 of them in this spot. It's like, man, I was going to get seeds sometime and raise them, but I decided I'm going to fence these in and then protect them and gather seeds. So right now, there are 100 of them within that confines and more on the outside. But what's happening here is over the years, I've discovered that these things need, and keep in mind, these are declining. There's discussions on what to do, nothing solid. And people think maybe it's absence of fire, but a lot of these prairies are burned anyway. And that doesn't seem to be it. But here they're increasing, maybe one of the only places in the whole Midwest or the whole biome that they're increasing a lot. And it's because of this tractor mowing and trampling. And to me, this is a reproduction of what bison and herbivores would have done on the original prairie. And this, I think, is a necessary feature for consideration in management. Some people would think that's nuts if they saw me out there mowing across rose plants and indigos and all these plants, which are there in the summer. They'd say, take a picture of him. We're going to turn him in to the prairie people. Look what he's doing. But it's a necessary disturbance that I think needs to be considered. This you can see in the middle of this. I've got dogwoods here that came into my prairie plantings, and I wasn't attentive to them, and so like I mentioned, early on, I cut lots and lots of things off these prairie hilltops because they were little tiny prairie spots on the top of the hills and otherwise consumed by woodland species. I was cutting those back, and they'd come back the next year or two, and it's like, okay, I'll never get ahead of them. So this cutting and dabbing the stem with Roundup does the job, and Roundup seems to break down the soil and not redistribute to other plants. people were using Tordon. That is terrible. It will translocate to other plants. You cannot spray these sorts of things and stay out of trouble. That spray will, you cannot get it selective enough where it won't spread and destroy things in the understory. So these things are cut, and I needed quite a bit of help. So I did get crews from the Natural Heritage Foundation, and oh, guess what? Okay, these slides bounced out of order between my Android and iPad. Another problem. I'm sorry. These are stakes within that of the Hills thistle. These are stakes that are marking individual little Hills thistles coming up in there. Again, just incredible numbers. Okay, back to we're treating the stumps of the woody vegetation and the dogwoods and sumacs and so on. And so I've had crews come out one day a year, and that's helped me a lot. I did all of this work practically by myself for decades, stayed sort of ahead, but these guys have really, really helped me clean things up yearly. So thank you for that. Another issue that has come up is, excuse me here, man, I looked over the order of these. Okay, got it. Well, okay, I'm going to bounce around. I'm sorry about that. From when I turned this on, it's they've redistributed. So early on in the in our ownership, I was shown, we saw that we had the Otoe skipper, which was pretty rare, very prairie dependent. And Dennis Schlicht said, Ray, you know, they're up on this hillside. If you burn this hillside, this top, and this is the only place they are, you're going to possibly eliminate your population. I said, what? I said, yep, all of the life forms are on top of the soil. They don't burrow or anything like that. If you burn the whole area where these things are residing, you can eliminate the species. We also later discovered we do have Leonardus skippers. It was the first one identified in eastern Iowa in the 1890s. I'm going to back up here. So this got me going to lots of invertebrate conferences. And Laura, how am I doing for time?
I'm muted. Let's see. You're at about 20. You're at 424 right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I got to go. So basically, the issues here is I did a lot of research with invertebrate people, went to lots of conferences, and the important issue, in my view, is that if you do anything, burning, as on that far hillside, or grazing, or mowing, or whatever, you should only do one portion of each biological section in your parcel. If you have a rocky hilltop and a sandy base, you should only part off maybe a third or fourth of each one of those. Don't do one and then the other, but just a portion of each of those biological communities, and do your burn or mowing or disturbance. Not the whole thing, to allow for reintroduction, repopulation of species that are harmed by mowing, trampling, or burning. And each one of those will harm certain species. And this is something that it needs a lot more traction. We'll go on here. You can see in this video, just in the upper left, there's a native, there's an oak tree and a native hillside poking out there. On the upper right, there's a hillside. Those are both native parcels. This is replanted in the center. There are native parcels on the far side of that valley. So by removing these trees and everything over the years, there's getting a more landscape appearance. This is just a little special treatment I'll do for multiflora rose that are prickly and hard to treat. And I don't think they take up Roundup very well in that fleshy stem. They tend to come back a lot. I take leather gloves, twist some of these stems together and just take a brush of Roundup and go up the top. But these cannot be sprayed. You don't dare do that. Another species that I worked on There were only a few green milkweed on the parcel. I ended up getting seeds, growing those at home for about 5 years, digging these in, planting them in certain places on the prairie. About 25, 30 years later, last year, these are 3 of them that I planted that had really good seeding and pods. And I finally said, okay, I'm going to get these pods and not let the monarchs get them and rabbits and everything else. So I did some harvesting. And I do have offspring of those that I've planted that are growing on the prairie. So a next generation by just spontaneously, and there are probably 30 or 40 individual plants that have gone that way. There's one of the green milkweeds that has come up. Just a scene in the spring. These are downy painted cups. And a brief thing, Ozark, Tony's going to be talking about this as one of the county properties. This is our son about 20, 30 years ago on one of those hilltops. Take a look at all the little woody stems coming up in the foreground. This area was acquired, but it was very densely overgrown. Here is a pre-view of that hilltop looking through. There's a tree on the right. You can kind of mark it. This is the post view that Laura and Tony will recognize, and the foxglove that are oak dependent that are manifesting in the savanna. There is off to the upper left, kind of a preview. You can see the shrubby stuff, and it's kind of scruffy, weedy plants, invasive plants in the foreground. That's a post view of the same tree, same site, a lot more open, flowers coming up in the foreground. You can see the sky on the far side. This is an area in Ozark also, foreground, trees cut and removed. This was probably 30 years ago. I did have a high school group, got a high school group out there. I did a lot of the work just on my own. And then in the background, that's a project that needs to be done next year. Then you move right on. I always like to reinforce to public groups that prairies are very workable for farming. The warm season grasses are a great option to the dried out pastures of our introduced pastures. So it's a food crop. It works well. It's important to include farmers. I also like to always, okay, here's Tony giving one of his talks, and you'll see a lot more of this. At the Prairie Talks, I always like to include the topic of diversity, the wide numbers of plants on a given community, like this hilltop, but also diversity in that Mother Nature has different communities here as opposed to the plateaus down and the tall grass and the sands nearby. And there's diversity in the spacing of the plants. Some are low, some are high, the roots have different occupying spaces in the ground. So diversity is an important topic. The other one is I always like to ask is where do we get our food from? And after you get by the 7th grader saying from the refrigerator, you get to soil. Okay, the soil in Iowa. Then tell me this then, where did our soil come from? I'll pause. I want to know what people think. We'll get into it and basically get down to the fact that, look at all of our tilled fields now, every one of them loses soil by percolation, wind, water, every one of them, even with our best practices. It won't last forever. The soil came to us from glaciers that dumped grit, silica, debris, and it's the living plants and community that settled on these areas, high or low, that created our soil. And so it's the living plant communities of the prairie that are responsible for our soil. And don't you want to have the models living and with us, so we know what's there, so we can actually make soil. And then you get into, this is every bit related to water, flooding, water percolation and cleanse, because the rainwater gets percolated and clean going through. It gets absorbed. It doesn't even run off these rocky hilltops with the vegetation. On grazed lands, it rolls right off of it. So water protection, it's our carbon sink. It is our rainforest for carbon sink protection underground in the soil. That's where our carbon is in the Midwest. A little bit in trees that gets recycled when the trees die. So that's Tony, and you're good. I did a little bit of this work. I worked a lot of hours on my own. Tony has got this supercharged on adrenaline, and I'm going to turn it over to Tony. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ray. I'm so glad that we asked you to talk today. I see how you bring so much to this, that you have both the specific knowledge of taking care of individual species that you want on your prairie, and the rare ones, the ones that the specific techniques to control, like the multiflora rose, one of the invasive species, and yet you're also looking at the big picture. You're thinking about biodiversity, the rare species, the composition of the plant communities, how to maintain those over time. And then one of the most important pieces is that you understand the role of people in all of this. Our systems for protecting land, our ability to get people to do the work that's needed on these places, and also to bring other people in and ask them the right questions to help them develop the sense that these prairies have value. So I think that's really great, and I really appreciate it that you would share that with us today. And I look forward to hearing from Tony, because he's one of the people that you've connected with. So there's just a nice little web forming here. I think is Tony, are you able to jump on now and share your screen?
I think Ray needs to unshare his screen, then I'll be able to share mine.
Okay.
No, I'm having too much of a good time.
We can continue the conversation a little bit.
Alrighty, folks, bear with me for a second here. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes, looks
Yes.
good.
Well, I want to really appreciate show some gratitude for the Tallgrass Prairie Center for having me on, and for Ray for kind of being one of my spark people to introduce me to what now I consider one of my greatest passions in life, and that is, remnant prairie and remnant prairie conservation and restoration. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we have going on some of our pieces here in Jackson County Conservation. So I work for Jackson County Conservation. And when I first started working for Jackson County Conservation, there was a few years where I didn't even know that we had remnant components to any of our properties. I taught a lot about prairie and interacted with prairie and prairie replantings and things like that. But it really wasn't until the pandemic, when we had a lot of time on our hands here in the office and not much going on, that I was fortunate enough to have a director who was like, let's go out and work on some of our remnant prairies. And I had no idea we had any. So it was pretty cool. Here's a few pictures of me doing cool stuff out in the field. That's what I look like. So I'm not going to get too in the weeds with how to identify remnant prairies necessarily. I had a professor in college who told me never to put more than like 7 words on a slide, but here I am with a whole bunch. But there's a few different mechanisms or a few different strategies that I use to look for areas that have remnant components: historic land cover type, historic record, aerial photos, LiDAR referencing, and kind of looking for plant species that are indicator species, plants that you really only see in remnant prairie situations. Some things that I use for Jackson County is I'm lucky enough to have people in my life like Ray, who were a part of the acquisition and protection of our remnants, that knew they were there for a long time, and kind of going back and using some of those techniques that I referenced to verify, right? So one of my major things that I'm trying to do with Jackson County Conservation is identify all the areas within our properties that have some sort of remnant or quality component, perform some restoration activities on them, kind of diversify that management scheme. I really believe in a diversification of management for diverse species. It's not just burning in the spring, so it's a whole host of different management activities. But one of my things that when I first started interacting with our remnant prairies on our properties is sites like this, going to an area that has remnant prairie components and parts of that remnant prairie or savanna or open oak woodland that looked a lot like this. Really overcrowded, a lot of shade tolerant species, not a lot of diversity, just a lack of management. And one thing that here's another kind of site what some of these areas kind of look like when I first come into them, really overgrown, right? Not really showing an assemblage of plants that would be indicative of a healthy prairie, more of a forest, right? So walking around some of these areas at like Ozark and Wildlife Area and some of our places that have remnant prairies, I find examples of things like this. It's hard to read what the sign says, but this sign is posted along an old level C that goes through a remnant prairie that says native prairie, no mow, spray or disturb, which I like the spirit of that. My predecessors had the foresight and the value of these areas to try to protect them. But one thing that I'm really doing is sort of battling the mismanagement or the lack of management that our agency didn't provide these valuable areas, right? So I like pointing out this sign when I'm out in the field, the native prairie, don't mow, spray, or disturb. I think we could just take out the mow and the disturb part to some degree and say the no spray. These prairies definitely could have benefited from the occasional mowing or the occasional disturbance, in my opinion. So some things that we do is we go to these areas that were definitely, remnant hill prairie or oak savanna or open oak woodlands. And kind of the first initial point of attack is just getting the bulk of the woody encroachment pushed back or removed. And something that really hooked me to kind of this remnant prairie restoration work is a lot of these remnant prairies are up on rocky hilltops, a lot of them on bluffs. Some of these bluffs are, 80 feet above the river or the creek. And a big part of that work is running chainsaws and dropping trees off an 80-foot bluff, which is pretty darn exciting. It was kind of an exciting piece that really hooked me in. So here is some images from Conservation Corps of Iowa crew that I've been working with the last few years, kind of doing some of that initial work. You see that open grassy pocket, and man, just dropping trees, getting them off the prairie, and in a lot of the case, dropping them straight off an 80-foot bluff, which is pretty darn sweet. Here's what a lot of these sites, kind of look like when we first come into and start removing the woody encroachment, invasive species, but also out of place native species. With the lack of disturbance, the prairies, the oak trees grew up, shaded it out, then eventually more shade tolerant species like sugar maple, hackberry, ironwood, things like that really came in. So these areas would be just choked out with little tiny, 20, 30-year-old maples and hackberries and things amongst with big open grown oaks. And then here we are kind of that initial woody removal. And then some of these sites, this isn't the exact same place, but after we come through, kind of looks like this, a little bit more open, like an open oak woodland savanna, kind of transitioning into kind of more of an open hill prairie. And one of my favorite examples of this, here's a little knoll that is off one of the main remnant prairies at Ozark Wildlife Area. And there's this little open pocket, and you can kind of see up and to the left all the little tiny maples and ironwoods kind of grown in and around the more open grown oak trees. This is a site, this particular little knoll, I started working on about 2 falls ago, and it looked just like this. But I came through and I kind of got rid of that initial, just with those maples, right? There's those maples. I came in the following spring, which was last May, looking around, kind of poking around, seeing what the response was, and also looking for morels at the same time. And then I was coming up to this knoll and I saw kind of a gleam of purple all over this knoll. And I walked up to it and it was covered in hundreds of birdsfoot violet, right? Then this was a species that I have not encountered or observed on this property whatsoever, but just one, fall to spring season with that kind of getting rid of some of that shade. There's still too much shade on that site. Encourage these dormant plants to show up in a flowering form. When I've been on that site many times before, and they didn't pop up until a little bit of that disturbance work. So I'm going to go briefly through some of the Jackson County conservation properties that have remnant prairie and savanna and open oak woodland components. And my favorite one is Ozark Wildlife Area. This is there's a lot of work to be done, and we have a lot of momentum going on out there that work. But this is a spot that has a matrix and a mosaic of these little quality sites. And you can just kind of see from these photos, my rough blazing star up there. And this is our only site that still has timber rattlesnakes. And I've even found juvenile timber rattlesnakes out there. So there's still recruitment, and these kind of hill prairies being critical habitat for, a species of special concern like that. We have Ray up there in the right hand corner from our early days of him showing me around at Ozark. And then down to finding, and fairly consistently, our little bumblebee friend down there in the bottom right, the rusty patch bumblebee, which is a federally endangered species. And they're, interacting and occurring on these areas, right? Kind of helps me justify the management that we're doing. Really quick, here's some kind of historical aerial views of the Ozark piece. I have some pretty rudimentary outlines here, but outline in red is kind of the areas that have that remnant prairie component. And you can kind of go back to some of that 1950s aerial view, seeing how open it was. And there was definitely some grazing action on some of these places, but a lot of it too steep to be really grazed too heavily. And you kind of jump forward that 2021 aerial view of the same area, and you can just really see how those trees have moved in with this lack of natural disturbance or lack of management. And you kind of see my LiDAR piece down there, kind of shows that textured area versus smooth area. The textured area within the red outline kind of indicates that there hasn't been much major soil disturbance or conversion. There's a different part of Ozark as well. Kind of the same difference. Here's just some pretty photos of some of the more open areas of the Ozark Hill prairies, right? So we have the big prairie when we're knocking back that encroachment line. We have our really cool dry pieces with some really cool, kind of Xercic prairie assemblage stuff going on. Some pretty pictures in the spring. You have your pucoons and the violets. Like I said, this is our Ozark is also one of our only areas that we're finding things like paintbrush and some of these other really cool, bright, charismatic bloomers. One of my favorite ones, that wood Bentney in there. You have my wife in the background, all fuzzed out. Some more pretty pictures of Ozark. And then the cool stuff. I not a lot of people give snakes and herps a lot of space, but I absolutely love them. I have some of my rattlesnake photos out there at Ozark Wildlife Area. Other cool herpetiles like our prairie ringneck snake and our 5-line skink. And of course, the rusty patch bumblebee again. And here's just some more examples of some of that, that restoration work, getting rid of the woody encroachment, kind of diversifying the management scheme, small but varied burn regimens, mechanical removal. And man, I would, someday in certain areas where it's appropriate, maybe mowing or haying at different times a year, if we ever get to that point, right? Here we are sitting on one of the kind of the fingers off of one of the main prairies above the North Fork of the Maquoketa River there in early fall. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a mile a minute. I'll just go really quick. Here's a few other areas that have remnant prairie components. Buzzard Ridge Wildlife Area has a small but mighty little hill prairie. That was one of our very first areas that we started doing work on a few years ago, really expanding its knocking back woody encroachment and doing some more well-rounded management schemes. Always beautiful fall colors. Here's me and some of my coworkers after a day really opening up some of these bluffy fingers off these prairies that were fully, encroached with woody and invasive species, and opening them up And then as time goes on, we continue to revisit these areas, continue to push back that encroachment line, and then do retreatment of the resprouts of the unwanted woody and invasive species. Black Hawk Wildlife Area has a very small, very small hill prairie, but there's some amazing species that show up on it. Our cylindrical blazing star and silky aster, and kind of a new-ish to me species, the stiff sandwort or rock sandwort. I could be getting that common name wrong, but the white one up in the up right-hand corner. I didn't know what this was, and I was trying to figure out what it was, and I was sending pictures around, and Mark Lefke, the state botanist, he got back to me he got back to me. He's like, oh man, that's such a cool plant. I'm keeping track of where this plant, currently exists in Iowa. And he was very excited that it showed up and wanted the coordinates to the site. And that was more kind of encouragement for the management of some of these areas. The diversification of fire. We definitely use fire management on our remnants, but they're small, they're patchy, very time of year. It's not burn it all down. It's burn a little hunk, sometimes in the spring, sometimes in the summer, sometimes in the fall, kind of depending on what's there and what we're trying to treat and achieve. And last but not least, this is the classic example of a nature preserve with the mentality of humans don't touch it, nature takes care of itself. But all of us as prairie people know that leaving a prairie alone in our modern world converts the prairie into not prairie, right? So we have this long strip, and you kind of see from the historic aerials that this area was pretty wide open with a few ravines of big oak trees. In my LiDAR screen down there, kind of really showing that grainy texture. It's very rocky, gravelly area. But you fast forward to 2021, and man, it's a cedar, Osage orange, honeysuckle jungle out there. And I made fun of this property for years because it was just sort of the showcase of invasive species, right? But I am coming around to this piece. We're starting to do some management on it. This fall, there's a few little open pockets that are still in this area that we're starting to do some management of that initial woody removal from the interior of the still open prairie and kind of pushing back that line. We're going to see how it responds in the future, because we're definitely going to get a response of gnarly invasive stuff, but trying to do better by some of these spots. And I guess we'll leave the questions up to the TPC crew to feed here, but I just want to thank you all for listening. Me yammering on really fast.
Oh, thank you very much, Tony. That was wonderful to see some more of the work that you do up there. I mean, I've caught a little glimpse of it at one season, but to I don't know, your story about those seeing all those bird's foot violets, I just got chills. I mean, I can just imagine what that was like to.
It's wild. This last season was probably, we had the most momentum during this last year in the last, since the pandemic, where we really started hammering the restoration hard. So I'm excited to see what the response is in the next, 5-10 years of what some of these management actions will actually end up doing.
Yeah, I guess I should probably disclose that I was a beneficiary of one of those responses to the management actions. I let Tony know, amongst some other people around the state, that I was looking for seed of a particular prairie grass for seed production at the Tallgrass Prairie Center. It's called prairie brome, or Bromus calmii, and Tony found some in one of these sites that he's been restoring, and shot me a picture of it. I went kind of crazy, and I did a happy dance actually, and then he sent me seed of that, and we've got it in the fridge right now. We're going to grow it out and hopefully have the genetics from Jackson County included in a new ecotype that'll be available for prairie restoration in a few years. So I got some real personal interest in what's going on there. And we have a couple of questions that we've prepared, but I'm not sure, because audience members, I can't see you, I can't hear you, but I wonder a little bit about what experience you have. I mean, is this looking at remnants with Tony and with Ray? Is this like a whole new brand new concept to you, or is this something you're familiar with? And have you explored the remnants in your own area? So if you have some experience with remnant prairies or have none, please share that with us in the chat if you get a chance, while we kind of start in with a few questions. I have a couple of questions for you guys, and then we'll see. I think there's at least one audience question as well. Um, I think Tony did a good job of showing those aerial views, and so we could see sort of what's happened to remnants over time. That when we think of protecting these areas, that we can, by protecting them from things, we can actually be degrading them over time. So we've got to protect them from development, but then protecting them from disturbance, that could be a problem. So we've seen that woody encroachment and loss of the light to those prairies over time. So, and then Tony, it looks like you're just doing a ton of work, and you're leveraging some resources like the Conservation Corps of Iowa and Minnesota to help you out with that. I see that Ray has involved people from Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. They have wonderful internships and opportunities every year. But this is kind of like the what would you do with $1 million question. Like if you could look at the goals and priorities you have for your remnant prairies, and you could think of, like what, like is there an additional staff person? Is there some additional money so you could give a stipend to some summer intern that could make them feel like they should work for you instead of Walmart? What's a chunk that the prairie community could provide to you to help you get that work done?
So you're asking if I had $1 million, what do I do with it?
Well, I don't think we can find 1 million, but what's like a chunk of change that would really help you out, or like, a position or.
Right. I think if there was some sort of thing that would really help my agency out with our management, it would be probably maybe a reconfiguring of a job description duties or an additional staff that was dedicated, more so, and or just specifically to like natural resources, natural areas management, where we have some of those titles and some of those things, but so often other endeavors pull attention away from it. And I'm not, I don't want to bash outdoor recreation by any means, but too much of our time and effort and money goes into mowing campgrounds than actual, conservation of sensitive areas. So I would like to see someone that the majority of their time goes to thinking out and managing in a well-rounded way the management of our areas, especially the quality remnant areas. That's what they do, not just when they can get to it, kind of stuff.
Are there other counties that have positions like that? Is it kind of a piecemeal thing across the state?
Yeah, I would say it's I mean, probably not a ton, but there are definitely people across the state who are doing amazing work. And a lot of it, in my mind, kind of does have to do with a little bit of maybe robustness of funding sources, but maybe not at the same time. There are definitely people in the county conservation system like myself that are, man, they're kicking butt out there when it comes to restoration and management work.
So is there like some networking and coordination among those people to help support each other in doing more of this, bring more people on board?
Yeah, I mean, there is, we definitely have a professional kind of organizations that we connect through. And Iowa Prairie Network, for me personally, has been one of those big ones. There's a few of us on the eastern side of the state that are trying to create and then eventually grow sort of a management co-op. We're kind of on the seed stage. We need to germinate and proliferate here. But seeds getting started. So there are definitely professional avenues, but hopefully over time we can keep momentum with people in the field, get more young people in the field who are excited about sensitive area conservation, restoration.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder, and maybe this is like opening this up to both you and Ray, to see if you want to contribute to this. Like when you think about all the different layers of um, I guess policy and such that are involved in land protection and management, are there particular like gaps in policy that make it more difficult to do this kind of work of protecting and caring for remnants? Or do we have a system that works pretty well? I mean, Ray's worked within the system of getting the easements and that kind of thing, but are there things that we could do to improve that?
I would say I'll let Ray speak here in a second. I'm not well versed in the policy world, but there are definitely mechanisms for protection. But you know, it'd be nice if there were policies or there were kind of more robust protections, or when it comes to if you have a remnant component to a piece of farm, if there was a better way of kind of tax break / funding for the upkeep and management of these areas, is not just setting it aside, but setting it aside and actually managing it, and being able to maybe get a payment or a significant tax break that makes it worth the consideration. That's my 2 cents.
Right. Yeah, I could see that, Ray.
Yeah, I think the governmental groups are just pretty far behind and not willing or able to put enough effort into the things we're talking about. One of the reasons the Prairie Network got going was just a handful of proponents throughout the state felt a void, for local landowners. The Conservancy was taking really high quality parcels and working on that. And then what happened, I think, was the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation, as well as a lot of private individuals doing seed collections, things like that, ended up really filling the void. And those are the ones that are really key right now to filling the void of, how do you find these places? What do you do with them? There needs to be a lot more with that. And if our public organizations would be able to measure or identify or promote the value, long-term value of what we're doing for society and the world, then I think they would do more and put more budget into it. Trees, for example, have always gotten a pretty good, pretty good deal with the DNR and public groups. Our county hired the first county forester in Jackson County, 35 years ago. But the prairie thing just hasn't caught up with that in the public arena.
Yeah, now they've got Tony, and he's a deforester, right?
That's right.
So we have a ton of wonderful questions that are coming to us. I think there's one in the Q&A. There's also a bunch in the chat. Are Tony and Ray, are you able to stay on past the 5 o'clock mark?
For sure.
Okay. I could talk with you guys all night. So let's do it. But let's see, maybe over a good homebrew or something like that.
There we go.
Let's see. I was going to see if I could order these questions a little bit. Oh yeah, there were a lot of comments about the aerial photos that you used in your talk, Tony, and wondered, people were looking for states, or sorry, ways to look these things up in Iowa and in different states.
Right. Oh, totally. I don't know about other states, but I mean, what I commonly refer to as open source and free, it's the Iowa GIS server. I believe that's maintained through the Iowa State University. And just type in Iowa GIS server. You should find it pretty readily, and you can find some different maps, and that will give you different data layers or different imaging layers. And you can go back to the early, 1930s aerial imagery. And periodically, a lot of times I'll use the 1950s ones, because the 1930s for my areas are so blurry, it's kind of hard to make out certain stuff. But then it also, that's where I, those LiDAR images as well. I've pulled from that site.
Oh, wow.
I don't have ready access to ArcGIS. Easier for me to do kind of homespun stuff, because I'm not looking at, I'm not making landscape models on GIS. I'm just looking at kind of aerial imagery down. So yeah, I have a GIS server. You can all find it. For other states, I wonder if other state universities maintain a similar system.
Yeah, the universities have a good geography department. Probably contact them and find out what the resources are in that state. I think that would work. And somebody said, long-time listener, first-time caller here, Kenny Slocum asks, how do you guys decide if and when to cut oak on those hill prairie sites? So specific
Right.
person. He's also one of those managers in another county who's doing the same kind of work.
So
Well,
yeah, go
go
for it, Ray.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Oh yeah, so yeah, that's a tough one, man. Like we talked about, trees get a lot of love, and trees, need to be where they belong, right? And they serve, many ecosystem functions. But in the prairie, a tree can create a lot of issues, right? And then kind of where we're at, we're on that interface of the tallgrass prairie into the woodland, eastern deciduous forest. So sometimes you make those decisions. If it's a certain site that was probably more open prairie, hill prairie, I'm probably cutting the tree, even if it's an oak. And I've heard a lot of feelings with cutting oaks, and I know that's kind of a dirty thing amongst a lot of people is cutting oaks, and I agree. I totally agree. There's definitely some subjectivity, and it really sometimes just depends on where I'm at and how I'm feeling. Some of our sites that definitely have some of more of those open oak woodland savanna characteristics, where there are still, you know, you know, probably settlement era or pre-settlement era oaks that are open and growing wide, definitely I'll leave some. I'm not necessarily dropping the giant old centennials, but some of those little trees, those little oaks, I'll leave some, I'll cut some, I'll girdle some and leave some standing dead. And kind of a lot of the oaks that I'm cutting in my areas are more red oak and black oak. And the way I understand from some of the literature that I've read is, red oak, black oak being present in our savannas and open oak woodlands, though was probably routinely top killed by indigenous set fire or wild set fire by lightning, and present there. So a lot of the oaks that I do cut, they said, historically, a lot of times these black oaks would be kind of more bushy or shrubby or grubby. Obviously, a few would make it past and reach maturity, but a lot of these oaks that I'm cutting, I won't necessarily chemically treat, but I'll let them kind of resprout in grubs, and then hopefully future management, like a diversification of fire, would keep them in that kind of alive but bushy state where they're still having positive interactions with insects for the host plant uses.
It's interesting to hear you talk about how sometimes your decisions are made sort of on an intuitive basis, but then you're also referring to the literature that you've read about this. So it seems like there's an interaction between just knowing the site, being there, being present there in multiple seasons, and also understanding the literature that backs up your work and informs it. We got another question.
Just a little
Yeah.
comment on Laura. I wrote about this briefly in the Prairie Management Guide. We have to recognize that these communities over eons of time have always been moving. You have woodlands moving into prairie, or prairie moving into savanna and woodlands, depending on weather, era, temperature, rainfall, fires. And so these are back and forths that have some long and short-term movement. So we are stuck in a situation where we need to kind of maintain a stable position in something that normally would be moving. And so I think that trying to have a little bit of everything is better in the savanna prairie junction than to try to make it one or the other. It's a blend anyway. So I think leaving some trees, and also moving into the woodland a little bit to take out some trees there, but not exclusively. You're maintaining an in-between zone in those areas. If you have a solid prairie, area that seems like it historically it would have been, and it was, you're going to take out all the trees there. And you get way in the valleys, and you're going to keep all the trees there, where it's naturally been. And so then I've also, with the oaks, I don't mind in these areas. Normally, most of these in Jackson County, you know, are white oak savannas. Um, the oldest trees that you see that are kind of, at least you could call them somewhat originals, that had progeny from forebears that are still there now, you know, are white oaks. But, you know, with diseases and things like that, I think it's a good idea, a safety thing in these areas to actually, I'll leave an occasional pin oak or red oak in those zones, or even a little one, just to say, okay, yeah, we're taking out some sizable ones, but there are a couple of little ones. We're just gonna leave those alone. You know, it's kind of in the middle of an opening, but that one stays, you know?
Yeah.
So I think we look for an even Steven
Yeah.
position.
Yeah,
It's not a simple answer, you know. It's and I like simple blanket answers. Just get rid of all the trees, right? But no, this is so much more nuanced, and I appreciate that. Do you mind if I ask another question from another person in the chat? Tamara says, "I'm joining from University of Iowa and manage McBride Nature Recreation Area. I was wondering if there's a method you use to determine the rate of how fast you restore an area from complete woody overgrowth, so that you do not over disturb them." So is that it, can you go too far too fast?
Yeah,
Well,
I would guess yes. I, you know, sometimes I wonder. I'm in the grand scheme of things fairly new to like restoration ecology and restoration work. I think, yeah, I think, you know, there's sometimes, and I'm sure there's probably more academic answers or studies for certain sites. Myself, anecdotally and personally, there are times where it's, you know, like that when I briefly mentioned McNeil Nature Preserve. Um, I feel like if I went and cut down a quarter of that property, myself and my staff would not be able to keep up with the response of the response of the invasives and unwanted woodies that are there, and would and potentially could create a bigger issue. I think
Yeah,
that's
that's an
definitely
important
a
consideration.
possibility. That's definitely a possibility, and an exact answer is I'm not sure. But you know, factoring in the scope of what you can do and can accomplish, and knowing that you get to go back and retreat those areas sometimes or multiple times, just factoring that in. It's not a one treatment and done. It's multiple phases and returns.
Right. Yeah, not getting
uh,
ahead of yourself. Ray.
yeah, I would suggest, you know, maybe a couple of things if I can think of them. The main one would be to work on areas that you think that ought to be cleared, because that's the most likely um, type of rebounder you get for the understory. So I always look for openings. So if there are openings in vegetation, areas with more recent decades of growth, you know, areas that have a lot of small trees that are chasing each other up, you know, they haven't been there more than 40 or 50 years. I do that. Openings, those types of trees, and then where you think it ought to be positioned, and just work on those. You're more likely to have the appropriate understory show up there because it's been shaded for least amount of time, and there might be a little bit more shade or a little bit more sun that's been able to reach that, so that you'll have restoration naturally of the appropriate things. The other thing is, there's no sense in spending a lot of initial time, especially when you have a big crew, to cut big trees. Go for little stuff. You can spend a whole day with a whole crew cutting up a big tree. Well, in 3 years, you leave it there and it's going to get a little bit bigger, but it won't change that more. But you can cover a whole lot more area by doing little stuff with a bunch of people. And that again opens up for appropriate understory, less amounts of invasives. So those are a couple of points I'd look at.
Good points. And I think Tony's identifying some of those openings even by those aerial views and seeing how they've changed over time. So identifying those sites that'll respond the best to management, I suppose, as well. We have another questioner who just first off starts out by thanking you. and says, do you have any advice for people who want to get involved, either through volunteer opportunities or doing restoration at home?
That's great. Yeah, I think, just to plug, I would say obviously there's Iowa Prairie Network, which that's a great voice and advocate for education and protection of remnant prairies. Iowa Prairie Network does a number of educational hikes and things throughout the year. Also, the Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation does a great job of having volunteer events, following what they're doing, and sometimes on quality remnant areas and volunteering your time. And not every county conservation board across the state is doing the same management work. But if you want to get involved with your local county conservation and, maybe suggest or bring up wanting to do work on remnant areas, if there is one present, you might get a varied response, and depending on who you're talking to or what's going on there, what their goals are. But it would be cool for more people to talk to the local county folks about concern about remnant areas. And sometimes there are folks who are doing volunteer days and whatnot. But if personally at your own residence, if you have a remnant, obviously management is costly, but thinking about having someone looking at it, at least identifying what is there and making those management decisions if you're willing to spend the money. But if you don't have a remnant component, I would just say do away with ornamentals and plant the native or close to native species as you can for your landscaping purposes. You plant showy natives, plant some native grasses, and it can still look like a darn garden. But holy heck, we need to stop being like Hank Hill and mowing everything and non-native species. We can all have a smattering of native species in our home landscape and actually benefit some native insects and some native wildlife instead of next to none.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, great advice. We have also I've been neglecting the Q&A, which is where I told people to put questions in the first place. So thank you for the person who asked Lori in the chat to check the Q&A. And we've got a couple questions there. Real quick, what are the sizes of remnant plots? Are they real small?
Yeah, yeah.
Just a couple acres, or what are you looking at?
I would say our biggest one, it's kind of fun because some of these spots, at least at Ozark, yes, it's small in the grand scheme of things, right? Acres to tens of acres. Some of the sites at Ozark are starting to bleed into each other a little bit, where it was, a quarter acre site, an acre site that is now kind of connecting as those sites. So now I would say my biggest complex of sites that are all kind of in one area starting to reconnect is about 5 acres, and then in the entirety of that property, if you count it all up, is roughly around 10, maybe a little bit more. So yeah, we're working pretty small.
It's small, but that's a big impact compared to what it was.
And it's a lot of work, especially for small crew kind of stuff.
Yeah, I want to make a comment. So if you see a small spot and identify that, if that spot happens to be in an area that has had common usage over a long time, you can talk to the farmers. Has this been fenced? Is this, oh yeah, okay, this has been part of this 20-acre parcel. Okay, how long? Well, my grandpa had this and that. If this area you see is in a definable area that you think maybe is at the same use and management, then take a look and anticipate that the rest of that parcel is recoverable, even if you can't see anything there, because you can start working on an area like that and go into the areas that you don't see anything and have those rebound very nicely. And all of a sudden, 2 acres ends up being 25 acres. So take a look at that for sure. Be on that lookout.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Anne asks, is anyone studying the mycorrhizal network in remnants? And that actually gets back into my history, and I can say that Kansas State University at the Konza Prairie was studying that back in the early 90s. I don't know if that work is continuing, and I don't know if Tony or Ray has potential to weigh in on that. I do know that the Prairie Enthusiasts is having a conference online, I believe, a virtual conference pretty soon. And there's somebody who is Liz Koziol, I believe is her name, who's going to be speaking about mycorrhizae in, I don't know if she should be talking about remnants, but she'll probably be talking about restoration of mycorrhizae. So there's potential answer there. I do want to get to Lori's question and then respect all of our time. We probably should hop off here pretty soon. But Lori says, I have a remnant bluff prairie in southeastern Minnesota that is in its first season of being restored. I'm wondering what you recommend when the gnarly invasives show up after the cedars, buckthorn, and other shrubby plants are removed and the soil is exposed to sunlight. I mean, this kind of references your answer to the question about the restoring the prairie in the Iowa City area and what you do when that stuff rebounds.
Well,
So
Right.
either one of you.
yeah, my comment is gnarl back.
I think we need t-shirts.
And you go back to this thing, for the woody ones, if you can get a group of people and go bit by bit, little stem by little stem, and cut and dab, and start working on them. That's been my routine. It's effective, intense, compact work. You may not cover a big area, but you stay with it and you can get ahead.
Right. I would echo Ray. Plus, depending on the species in question or multiple species in question, doing a little research on the most effective treatment or product and timing. If I'm going in and I'm doing a good job of cutting and dabbing, in early May, but that thing is sapping like heck and is pushing all my precious herbicide out of it and maybe ineffective completely. Looking at timing and proper product and treatment of an individual species, and yeah, it's a lot of work, but you wouldn't want to be ineffective / accidentally, you just know what you're dealing with the best you can and deal with it.
Yeah. Oh, it's been so wonderful talking with you guys. I really appreciate your taking the time and all of the people in the audience who stuck with us up to this point and asked such great questions. I've learned a lot. I can't wait to get out in the spring and see the Puccoon, and I want to go see that Castanea, the paintbrush that you have. And there's so many wonderful things to explore, places to go. And we thank you for all the parts that you have played in protecting and caring for these places. So hopefully we spread the word.
Well, I really appreciate you having us on, and yeah, go plant some prairies, go support, prairies integrated into our agricultural system, and, get involved and fall in love with some plants out there.
Thanks to Laura, your whole team. Thank you.
Thank you, Ray.